Hey everyone, Kyle Erickson here. This is the M2 MacBook Air. There's been a decent amount of info and thoughts that have poured out on this machine, but a lot of it has been from people's use with the base model. The model I have here has some upgrades, and I not only want to go over my experience with this machine and everything that I've been testing out, but I'd also like to touch on why, to get the most out of this machine, you'll likely want to upgrade to similar specs as well. The M2 Air comes in 4 different colors: Space Gray, Silver, and the 2 newest editions, Midnight and Starlight. The color I chose was Starlight. I decided not to go with Midnight like a lot of other folks are. It just seems like Midnight has some issues with fingerprints, and my iPad is Starlight, and I love the look of that machine. The color is elegant looking, paired with a complete redesign of the Air. Gone are the days of rounded surfaces and tapered wedge style designs that has always been a part of the Air, which in my opinion was due for an overhaul. It's been replaced with a look that is much more in line with the MacBook Pro lineup, with straight flat surfaces and rounded corners. It's a little bit thinner than the M1 Air, coming in at 1.13 centimeters tall versus 1.61 centimeters at the tallest point of the M1 Air. It's just a touch lighter than the previous gen as well, coming in at 2.7 pounds where the old version was 2.8, and it has roughly the same dimensions otherwise. For me, this is a much cleaner design. The M1 Air just feels a bit dated at this point. This new style seems a lot more simple and modern. The form factor and the weight of the M2 Air lends itself really well to using this anywhere, whether you're at your desk or on the couch, or especially if you're traveling with this or taking it anywhere. It's a lot less bulky than the MacBook Pro. The M2 Air still only does have 2 USB-C ports along the side, but now you have a MagSafe port back again, which is really nice because I know a lot of people like myself who end up using these machines a lot at a desk would end up using one USB-C port for charging and the other one for an external display, and then you couldn't plug anything else in. So now at least you have one more port available in that instance. They are both Thunderbolt and USB 4 compatible, capable of 40 gigabits per second transfer speed. Great if you've got an external USB 4 drive like this little guy here, which is a must for me because I need high transfer speeds for large files, and I do run a lot of apps off these drives as well. That is it for USB ports though, which I think is somewhat unfortunate given that the other side of the machine just has a headphone jack. But that 3.5mm output now has advanced support for high impedance headphones if you're an audiophile, and just speaking of sound, you no longer have those speaker grills on each side of the keyboard. There's a whole new audio setup in here, which I will talk about in a little bit. The keyboard has a full height top function row, and it's really nice to type on, not unlike most new Macs these days. The top row of keys is a little bit easier to touch and is a little bit more comfortable to work with, especially Touch ID. And I think that overall it just looks better than the old half-height style. Above that keyboard is the display, which for me is the most noticeable change design-wise. You do have a notch, which I've already gotten used to on my MacBook Pro, but the bezels are much smaller on this machine than on the M1 version, leading this M2 version to be 13.6 inches instead of 13.3 on the M1. Now that might seem like not much of an increase, but I do find it noticeable. It's also got improved color specs, going from millions of colors to a billion, and it goes from 400 nits peak brightness on the M1 to 500 on this M2. So a 20% gain there. Just be aware that that jump in brightness isn't super noticeable. Regardless, this is still a really nice display, not on the level of the mini LED powered MacBook Pros, but still fantastic. That notch does contain a new webcam as well, going up from that old 720p potato camera up to a 1080p version that's much better quality. So if you do spend a lot of your day on calls or FaceTiming folks from your Mac, you will see quite a difference there. I notice a lot more definition and a lot less noise than that old 720p camera. And for a laptop camera, especially with a display that's this thin, it's great quality. Design-wise overall, this is a pretty huge overhaul when you start going over all that's changed. And what I think is become less clear to some extent is how much better the M2 Air performance is over the M1. So the first thing that I want to address here is the base model M2. I've seen a fair amount of reviews out there testing this version with the M2 chip with 10 GPU cores with a 256 gig SSD with 8 gigs of RAM. I don't think anyone should buy that version. One thing a lot of people have complained about is the speed of that 256 gigabyte SSD on the M2 machines and how it's a lot slower than the speed it used to be, and I'll tell you why that's happened. Apple is now using a single denser 256 gig NAND chip for their SSDs, where they were previously using two 128 gig chips. This is likely why you see those lower transfer rates, because that speed can no longer be doubled up in the same way, and it's the same reason why the 512 gig SSD, which does still split those chips, does run at a much higher speed. In regards to the RAM, I see a lot of people trying to do pretty resource heavy stuff on the base 8 gigs of RAM. And it's likely if you're doing any kind of video editing or heavy computing that is going to be your bottleneck. Sometimes I open CLEANMYMAC on my Mac Mini just to see how much RAM usage I have, and it's always very close to that 8 gigs of RAM with it being idle, so very easy to go over that. So no matter how fast your CPU or your GPU runs, it's always going to be held back. And it's also not going to be as good for your system if it's constantly having to dip into virtual memory swapping. This model that I have also has the 10-core GPU over the base chip that has 8 cores, but it has 16 gigs of RAM and a 512 gig SSD, and it sits right at $1,699, which is $300 more than the comparable M1 Air with similar options, and $300 less than the 14-inch M1 Pro, so it's sitting right in the sweet spot price-wise, where it still makes sense to grab this machine over the Pro or the M1 version. I've tried out a number of measurable things that I would consider fairly resource-heavy tasks that I use or have used in my daily workflow. I ran all of those things both on the M2 Air and on my M1 Mac Mini. I wanted to use the Mac Mini because it does have active cooling versus the passive cooling that's in the M2 Air and the M1 Air, because that should be technically the most performant M1 chip. I rendered out the same complex 3D models in Blender, and I found the M2 to be about 20% faster in most cases. But the real difference for me was in Final Cut Pro, where I saw render times drop almost in half. For me, that's a huge deal because I do spend a lot of my time working in that app. When testing out Xcode compile times, I found that the M2 compiles about 30% faster than the M1, so there is a noticeable difference in all those aspects, where if you're doing a lot of these type of tasks, it will save you some time. Finally, I did also do some comparisons with the M1 Pro and some interesting things there. There is a new encoder and decoder included in the M2 chip specifically for H.265 video, which is what I film most of these videos in, and it actually outperforms the M1 Pro in render times because that rendering speed is limited to the encoding and decoding of that footage. If you move to something like ProRes, the M2 will be much faster though. With Blender, it's about 20 to 30% faster on the M1 Pro as well. And I think for most things, this M2 MacBook is going to sit right in the middle performance-wise between the M1 and the M1 Pro, probably with a slight tilt towards the M1 Pro side. I didn't test out anything in relation to gaming because honestly, gaming on a Mac is not really my thing. I've got consoles for that, but one thing I do a lot of is listen to audio, whether that be on Spotify or just consuming content. This machine has a completely revamped audio system, going from a pretty simple stereo speaker setup to a 4-speaker sound system that supports spatial audio. It does have fantastic sound, and it's greatly improved over that previous version. It's still head and shoulders above most laptops, although it's not quite on the level of the Pro machines. It sounds crystal clear, and it does get quite loud if you turn up the audio all the way, and it doesn't result in any distortion. With that music and audio cranked up and doing all these tests, and really anything that I've done off this machine so far, I've had everything running off of battery power, which has outstanding performance just like the previous Gen Air and most MacBooks these days. I was hopping back and forth from resource-heavy work to browsing the web, using Google Docs and creative apps, and I can say that I never saw a significant battery drain at any point during my usage. I think you can definitely use this and get a full workday out of this if you're doing fairly resource-heavy stuff. And when it is time to plug it in, I found it took me just under an hour and a half to fully charge this from a low battery. I did opt for the 67 watt wall charger, and that one is going to be the one that charges the fastest. There's also a standard 30-watt charger and a new 35-watt dual charger, but if I'm picking between any of those, I'm always going to choose the fastest charging option, but maybe if you do need an extra USB-C charging port, the dual charger might be more useful to you. When you package everything up, I do think that the M2 MacBook Air is a great option for a lot of people. This definitely sits right in the middle of the M1 Air and the M1 Pro, both in price and performance. But for me, the super small form factor of this combined with the performance is really what sets this apart. This would be my go-to travel machine. I know a lot of people won't care about the size as much as others, but if you do, I definitely think this is worth checking out. Again, the only thing that I would be aware of in all of this is that base model of the M2 Air is by no means nowhere near as equal to a version that has bumped up specs. And I think for most people, you'll probably want to start at least 16 gigs of RAM and a 512 gig SSD. But that really all comes down to how you use your machine and what you're looking for, which I'd love to know. Do you think that this machine will satisfy your needs? Is this something that you're actually looking at? Drop a comment down below and let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this video, pin down that like button and don't let it escape. If you want to see more tech-related content, or if you think that we could be sworn enemies that go through an intense struggle only to find that we should be best friends, please subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next upload.